In the sweltering heat of July 20th, 1973, Bruce Lee, the man who had come to redefine martial arts, Eastern philosophy, and global cinema, entered the Hong Kong apartment of actress Betty Ting Pei wearing his iconic slim-fitting white-collared shirt, crisp black slacks, and polished black shoes. His body lean and trained like a warrior. His mind sharp with ideas for his upcoming movie Game of Death, completely unaware that within a matter of hours, he would become the center of one of the most baffling and hotly debated deaths in entertainment history. One that would spark conspiracy theories involving everything from triad assassinations and pharmaceutical sabotage to ancient curses, government, plots, and cinematic karma. A story made all the more chilling by the parallel fate that would befall his own son 2 decades later. That day, Bruce had complained of a headache, prompting Betty to offer him a painkiller Icwajesic, a common medication containing aspirin and a muscle relaxant, but shortly after taking it, he laid down for a nap and never woke up. His death officially ruled a cerebral edema, or brain swelling, despite no prior signs of trauma or illness, with toxicology reports failing to find lethal substances in his system. Though some experts questioned the thoroughness and honesty of the investigation, especially since Bruce had previously collapsed during a film shoot 2 months earlier under similar symptoms and had been rushed to the hospital then as well, surviving that episode with a mysterious diagnosis that raised more questions than answers. Whispers quickly spread that Bruce had been murdered, possibly by the Chinese triads. Angered by his refusal to pay for protection during his rise in Hong Kong cinema, while others pointed to his breaking of long-standing martial arts taboos by teaching kung fu to Westerners, believing a death touch or dim mak had been placed on him by vengeful masters who saw him as a traitor to ancient tradition, and yet more cynical minds suspected foul play from within the industry itself, with rumors that Hollywood elites or pharmaceutical companies wanted him silenced before he could gain too much global influence. Especially considering Bruce had begun speaking publicly about racial inequality in film and had just negotiated full creative control over his next movie. Major power shift in an era where Asian stars were rarely allowed to lead in Western media, making his sudden collapse in a woman's apartment a tabloid sensation ripe for exploitation, complicated by the fact that he was married to Linda Lee at the time, forcing his widow to defend his integrity while navigating global media scrutiny, political suspicion, and the creeping realization that the world wasn't willing to let Bruce Lee rest in peace. Not when so many questions about his death remained unanswered. As autopsy reports were published and scrutinized, new theories emerged involving allergic reactions, heat stroke, epilepsy, and even organ failure. Yet none aligned perfectly with the facts, and the Hong Kong coroner's final ruling, death by misadventure, only fueled the fire, sounding more like a convenient dismissal than a conclusive answer, especially when witnesses around Bruce began contradicting each other. With timelines of the evening changing, stories evolving, and phone records becoming mysteriously unavailable, while fans began to notice eerie patterns, like Bruce predicting his own early death in interviews and leaving cryptic notes about not living past 32, belief some close friends claimed stemmed from family superstitions dating back to his birth in the Year of the Dragon, when his parents reportedly dressed him as a girl to ward off evil spirits that had taken other children in their family. Chilling footnote that would later be tied into the so-called Lee family curse, a phrase whispered more and more loudly in Hollywood circles as years went by and fate prepared to strike again. Despite the haunting nature of his death, Bruce's legacy only grew, immortalized in martial arts classics like Enter the Dragon, with his face printed on posters, shirts, and murals around the globe, his teachings quoted by CEOs and spiritual gurus alike. Yet behind the legend loomed a deeper fear that his demise wasn't natural, that it was orchestrated, timed, or perhaps destined as part of something greater and darker. And nowhere was that fear more palpable than in the life of his only son, Brandon Lee, who grew up under the enormous weight of his father's name, inheriting not just his chiseled features, charisma, and martial arts skills, but also his fans' expectations and the shadow of his death, which would eventually catch up with Brandon in 1993 in a stunningly similar and even more suspicious way. But before that, young Brandon tried to find his own path. often wearing styles that echoed his father's neatly tucked white shirts. Sharp pants, clean black boots, stepping into films slowly with roles in action thrillers, before landing the lead in The Crow, a dark comic book adaptation about a man resurrected from the dead to avenge his murdered fiancée. A role that would become tragically prophetic, for during a nighttime shoot in Wilmington, North Carolina, a prop gun used in a scene was improperly loaded, discharging a real bullet fragment into Brandon's abdomen, killing him on set at age 28, and plunging the entertainment world into a second Lee family nightmare, eerily timed almost 20 years after Bruce's death, sparking even more elaborate theories that someone or something was determined to end the Lee bloodline before it could thrive again. With rumors of sabotage, ghostly revenge, and even ancient curses again making headlines, the parallels too eerie to ignore, especially considering that in Game of Death, Bruce had portrayed an actor who was shot on set during a scene and replaced with a double, blurring fiction and reality in ways that still send shivers down the spines of fans and investigators alike. Following Bruce Lee's sudden and still unexplained death in 1973, the world mourned the loss of a cultural icon, but none more than his son Brandon, who was just 8 years old at the time and would grow up haunted by the silence that followed. His father's collapse, eerie quiet, not just of grief, but of unanswered questions, concealed truths, and a legacy that was both empowering and terrifying, a double-edged sword that carved deep into Brandon's life as he matured into a man, uncannily like his father in look, voice, and movement. So much so that by the time he entered adulthood, producers, fans, and martial arts communities alike began calling him the Dragon Reborn, a title that weighed heavily on his shoulders, especially as rumors of a curse continued to swirl in hushed tones, echoed in magazines, talk shows, and fan forums. Brandon, determined to honor his father's memory while escaping his shadow, began training in Jeet Kune Do, very martial arts philosophy his father developed, and started acting in low-budget action films throughout the 1980s, always donning his father's sleek and minimalist wardrobe, white shirts, black pants, clean shoes, rejecting flashy Hollywood styling for a grounded aesthetic. One rooted in discipline and precision, but behind his calm demeanor, Brandon carried a growing dread one. He often joked about in interviews, but admitted in private made him feel watched or followed, especially on film sets where strange accidents would occur. From malfunctioning lights to a serious fall during a stunt rehearsal that sent him to the hospital, an incident eerily reminiscent of his father's mysterious collapse on the set of Enter the Dragon. It was during this time, in the early 1990s, that Brandon was cast as the lead in The Crow, a dark, supernatural film about a man murdered alongside his fiancée who returns from the dead to avenge their deaths, a role soaked in poetic vengeance, an eerie symbolism that Brandon threw himself into fully, often staying on set late, practicing alone in his white shirt and black pants, walking the gothic alleyways of the set under artificial rain, whispering lines to himself while crew members reported strange cold spots, flickering lights, and a general sense of foreboding that was often brushed off as the mood of the shoot, but which several claimed turned into outright fear in the days leading up to the incident that would change Hollywood forever. On March 31, 1993, during the filming of a pivotal scene in which Brandon's character is shot by thugs, the prop gun that was meant to fire blanks instead fired a live fragment unbeknownst to the prop team. A bullet tip had become lodged in the barrel from a previous mishandling, and when the blank charge was fired, the pressure sent the fragment directly into Brandon's abdomen, tearing through vital organs and sending him crashing to the floor of the set. Still in his white shirt, now stained red as the cast and crew screamed and ran to him, initially thinking it was an elaborate stunt until they realized he wasn't moving, his breathing shallow and his eyes unfocused, and as paramedics rushed him to the hospital, chaos erupted behind the scenes, with producers scrambling for explanations and phone calls being made to media outlets before Brandon had even arrived at the ER, where surgeons worked frantically for 6 hours before pronouncing him dead at the age of 28, almost the exact age his father died under equally strange and suspicious circumstances. The public was shocked, but the film industry was shaken to its core, not only because of the tragic loss, but because of the haunting symmetry between father and son. Both dying while making films, both collapsing unexpectedly, both dressed similarly, and both surrounded by strange rumors of sabotage, curses, and unseen forces. And soon, theories exploded across newspapers, television, and early internet forums, with some claiming the accident was staged to mirror Bruce's game of death, a film where Bruce's character is also shot during a staged assassination scene, while others pointed fingers at the production's low-budget handling of firearms, calling it negligence of the highest order, though others still insisted there was something more deliberate at play, especially after reports emerged that someone had tampered with prop equipment earlier in the week, and that a different crew member had mysteriously quit the day before the fatal scene, citing bad energy and feeling cursed on set. Meanwhile, Linda Lee, widow of Bruce and mother of Brandon, was thrust once again into an unimaginable grief. Having now lost her husband and only son under shockingly similar and suspicious conditions, and though she publicly called Brandon's death an accident. In later interviews, she revealed doubts about how the weapon was handled and questioned the chain of command on set, noting how quickly evidence disappeared and how rapidly the narrative was controlled by studios eager to minimize legal risk, while fans began circulating photos of Bruce and Brandon side by side in matching white shirts and dark pants, calling them ghost twins or the cursed legacy, fueling decades of speculation that a larger, more sinister force was at work, possibly tied to ancient Chinese beliefs about familial energy and vengeance, or perhaps linked to the lie, families' crossing of sacred martial traditions by teaching outsiders, theory supported by old martial arts masters who claimed Bruce had unbalanced the order and that the debt was now being paid through his bloodline, though more modern. Theorists suggested Hollywood sabotage, citing the possibility that Bruce had been silenced by pharmaceutical interests and Brandon had stumbled into a similar trap by speaking openly about systemic racism and greed. In film, whatever the truth, the deaths of Bruce and Brandon Lee remain among the most shocking and mysterious in entertainment history. And the darkness that clung to their lives only seemed to deepen in the aftermath of their deaths. With both men forever frozen in time, their faces etched into history not only for their cinematic brilliance, but for the lingering question that surrounds them still. Were they victims of coincidence? Were they silenced by a force that feared what they represented: strength, independence, and unfiltered truth? In the wake of Brandon Lee's tragic death, the world of Hollywood found itself shaken, not just by grief, but by the growing realization that two of the most iconic figures in martial arts and cinema, history, Bruce and his son Brandon, had died under hauntingly similar and suspicious circumstances, both young, both in the middle of promising film projects, both in pristine white shirts and black pants that fans would come to see as a ghostly uniform, marking their untimely exits from life. And both deaths laced with unanswered questions, inconsistencies, and chilling parallels that many found impossible to dismiss as mere coincidence. In the immediate aftermath, Brandon's death prompted a chaotic investigation, with law enforcement, the studio, the prop department, all scrambling to explain how a real bullet fragment found its way into a prop gun on a professional film set, especially since the weapon had supposedly been cleared just hours earlier. Yet crucial evidence vanished, bullet casings were lost, and the gun itself was reportedly mishandled after the shooting, fueling suspicion of either a cover-up or gross negligence. And though no criminal charges were ever filed, the case sparked public outrage and debate across newsrooms, talk shows, and newly growing internet forums, with fans digging into the details of both Bruce and Brandon's deaths, drawing timelines, compiling interviews, and pointing out eerie coincidences, like how Bruce had filmed a scene in Game of Death where his character is shot on a movie set by a real bullet hidden in a prop gun, in exact mirror of Brandon's fate decades later, and how both had publicly expressed anxiety about dying young, with Bruce once saying, "If I should die tomorrow, I will have no regrets," and Brandon telling a friend shortly before filming The Crow, "Sometimes I feel like I'm not meant to live past 30. Sentiments that now read like tragic foreshadowing or prophetic warning. Meanwhile, Brandon's fiancée, Eliza Hutton, who had planned to marry him just days after filming ended, was left devastated and reportedly withdrawn from public life, speaking only rarely about the incident, while Brandon's mother, Linda, continued to fight for safety reforms in film production, pushing for stronger regulations around prop weapon usage. But even as she advocated for change, she never quite escaped the belief that something darker may have been at play, especially when stories began surfacing of unusual occurrences during the filming of The Crow, such as equipment malfunctions, sudden fires, and a crew member being electrocuted on set, along with a construction worker accidentally driving a screwdriver through his hand, prompting some to describe the shoot as cursed even before Brandon's death. And then came the footage. The scene during which Brandon was fatally wounded had been captured on film, and though it was never publicly released and reportedly destroyed, its existence cast a long shadow over the investigation, with rumors swirling that copies had been kept, shared, or even buried by the studio to protect itself from lawsuits. But conspiracy theorists believed the footage contained visual proof of something strange, perhaps sabotage, perhaps intentional harm, or perhaps something even more unexplainable. And this idea only intensified as online forums and documentaries began revisiting Bruce's final days, comparing medical reports, tracking mysterious phone calls made from his hotel the night he died, questioning why he'd been in Betty Tingpei's apartment alone in the first place, particularly when Betty herself gave contradictory statements to police, first claiming Bruce had fallen asleep peacefully, and later admitting he had been in pain, leading some to accuse her of withholding information or being pressured into silence. Others returned to the theory of a triad hit, noting Bruce's rising influence in the East and West had made him a target of jealousy and financial leverage, especially if he was cutting into protected profits or refusing to bow to old systems of control, and that perhaps Brandon had inherited not only his father's talent, but his enemies as well, individuals or organizations that couldn't risk a second Lee becoming a cultural juggernaut. On the other side of the spectrum, spiritualists and occult researchers fixated on the so-called Lee family curse, tracing it back generations and noting that Bruce's brother had died in infancy and that Brandon was buried beside his father, both graves engraved with poetic lines about brevity and destiny, which seemed to cement the notion that the family was marked by fate. Yes, and even skeptics found themselves disturbed by the sheer number of strange coincidences, especially as more came to light, such as Bruce Lee's home being mysteriously purchased by a Chinese tycoon shortly after his death and sealed off to the public, or how Brandon's death led to a media frenzy, but no substantial changes in set safety, almost as if a narrative was being pushed to keep the public from digging too deeply. Fans, however, did dig, creating timelines, mapping out connections, even speculating about CIA or FBI involvement given Bruce's connections to American military training programs and his outspoken criticism of institutional racism, while others speculated about Hollywood insiders with too much to lose if Brandon became a star who couldn't be controlled, though no definitive proof of foul play was ever uncovered, just whispers, inconsistencies, lost evidence, and a feeling that something didn't add up. Meanwhile, The Crow was completed using body doubles and early CGI, and released to widespread acclaim, praised for Brandon's performance and emotional depth. Yet viewers couldn't shake the eerie sense of watching a ghost on screen, especially in scenes where his character rises from the grave, bloodstained and vengeful, wearing that familiar white shirt and black pants, just as Brandon had been wearing in real life when he died, and to this day. The film holds a cult status not just for its style, but for its tragic backstory, cinematic tombstone for a life cut short, and yet the public's fascination hasn't faded, with documentaries, podcasts, and conspiracy videos continuing to explore the mysteries of the Lee family, trying to make sense of a narrative that feels scripted by fate itself. One where two of the world's most iconic martial artists rose and fell in near-identical arcs, leaving behind a legacy that is both inspiring and terrifying. A legacy dressed in white and black, forever marked by questions that no autopsy, no police report, and no studio press release has ever fully answered. As the years passed, and both Bruce and Brandon Lee remained etched in the public imagination, not just as martial arts legends, but as tragic figures haunted by an unrelenting curse, Theories about their deaths only deepened in complexity and popularity, especially as new documents, long-buried interviews, and whispers from industry insiders began to emerge that painted a murky portrait of their final days, filled with strange coincidences and chilling premonitions, like how Bruce had once insisted on filming his own funeral sequence in Game of Death. Lying in an open casket in the exact same white shirt and black pants he would be buried in just months later, a decision that felt disturbingly prophetic. In hindsight, and how Brandon, too, filmed scenes of death and resurrection while on the set of The Crow, covered in fake blood in an eerily symbolic wardrobe that resembled what he'd wear the day he died, leading fans and analysts alike to wonder whether the Lee family had somehow become trapped in an archetypal narrative, one that art, life, and fate couldn't help but repeat. These eerie parallels took on new weight in the early 2000s when a former Hong Kong film associate released an unpublished journal of Bruce Lee's handwritten notes, which included cryptic lines like, "They watch when I sleep and I must not give them everything," which some interpreted as evidence that Bruce was aware he was being surveilled, possibly by Chinese intelligence. American agencies or rival studios angered by his independence and cross-cultural influence, though. Others dismissed the notes as mere fragments of philosophical musings. Yet when juxtaposed with Brandon's own interview soundbites, where he often spoke about feeling isolated, watched, and pressured into becoming a continuation rather than a person, the writings seemed more like a shared burden, a shadow, that passed from father to son. And it was this psychological inheritance that many began to explore in documentaries and films that emerged in the wake of Brandon's death. Like Dragon, the Bruce Lee story 1993, which dramatized Bruce's life, but included a fictional demon that stalked him and his child. Metaphor that some claimed was shockingly accurate, given how Brandon's own death occurred just months before the film's release. Almost as if the story had manifested itself into reality. Meanwhile, Linda Lee Cadwell became increasingly reclusive, protecting what remained of her family's privacy, while still occasionally granting interviews in which she hinted at frustration over how little real investigation had been done to both Bruce and Brandon's deaths, pointing out that both cases were quickly closed with simplified explanations. Bruce's due to a cerebral edema, possibly triggered by medication, and Brandon's due to a tragic accident involving prop mismanagement. Yet neither explanation satisfied the public, nor explained the depth of mysterious circumstances involved, particularly as more professionals began to come forward with odd memories from both sets, like a former prop master from Crow, who confessed in 2005 that he'd warned about unsafe gun handling procedures a week before Brandon was killed and was told to let it go, or a stuntman on Game of Death who said Bruce had fainted on set days before his death and was visibly afraid of something he wouldn't talk about. And while none of these accounts offered hard proof, they added to the growing suspicion that the deaths were more than just tragic happenstance, potentially part of a pattern that involved negligence at best and coordinated silencing at worst. Fans, increasingly convinced that the Lee family had been targeted, began dissecting film stills, wardrobe choices, behind-the-scenes footage, and even astrological data to find meaning, discovering that both father and son died in the Chinese Year of the Ox, both at similar ages, both while working on films that depicted death and spiritual themes, and both after experiencing a surge in media attention for challenging cultural norms. Bruce for breaking racial barriers in Hollywood, and Brandon for playing a rare Asian American lead in a mainstream Gothic action film, prompting conspiracy theorists to suggest that the entertainment industry simply wasn't ready for their power, or that old martial arts factions who resented Bruce's globalization of their secrets had exacted revenge not just on him, but on his bloodline. And while skeptics pushed back, arguing for Occam's razor that these were tragic but explainable events in a dangerous industry, the evidence of repeated failures, missing documentation, rushed verdicts, and the eerie overlap of symbolic and literal death continued to draw new attention every year, particularly on the internet, where YouTube creators, podcast hosts, and amateur sleuths kept the story alive, sometimes to the point of obsession, comparing the lie mystery to other Hollywood cold cases like Natalie Wood or Marilyn Monroe, but always noting that this one felt more mythic. more cursed, more like the unfolding of an ancient story in modern form. Even those close to the family acknowledged the weight of that narrative. Shannon Lee, Brandon's sister and Bruce's daughter, spoke in recent years about how the public often treats her father and brother more like legends than real people, and how hard it is to live under the dual shadow of such talent and tragedy, especially when the questions never stop and the grief never ends. And yet she also admitted that their deaths, just unresolved and painfully poetic, have served to immortalize their ideals, making Bruce and Brandon not just victims, but symbols of struggle, strength, and the cost of brilliance in a world that may not know how to protect those who challenge the rules too quickly, too powerfully, or too publicly. And so, the story of Bruce and Brandon Lee continues to haunt, not because of ghosts or curses alone, but because it speaks to something universal: the fear that genius comes at a price, that the ones who shine brightest may burn out not by accident, but by design, leaving behind not just films and philosophies, but riddles too deep for any single answer to satisfy. In the decades since the tragic and unexplained deaths of Bruce and Brandon Lee, their story has become more than just a Hollywood cautionary tale. It has evolved into a cultural myth, a modern legend woven from threads of real-life brilliance, cinematic immortality, and haunting questions that still echo with every new generation of fans and filmmakers who discover their work and feel the unshakable sense that something was taken too soon, too strangely, and with far too many unanswered questions. Because despite multiple investigations, endless documentaries, and thousands of articles, the gaps in their stories remain as wide and chilling as ever. Starting with Bruce's sudden death in 1973, ruled an allergic reaction to a common painkiller. Even though his health had been impeccable, his fitness unmatched. And his own diaries spoke of growing unease and surveillance, and ending with Brandon's fatal shooting on the A set of The Crow. An accident so improbable it seemed more like the plot of a horror film than a real-life event, especially as more details emerged, like how the bullet that killed him wasn't a blank at all, but a dislodged real slug left behind in the barrel. Due to a previously fired dummy round, a chain of negligence so convoluted and unprofessional it bordered on suspicious, yet no one was charged. No studio was shut down, and production resumed with digital doubles and somber tribute, leaving fans to question how such an elite Hollywood crew could allow the son of Bruce Lee to die in the exact way his father had once staged and filmed a gunshot on set, wearing the same white shirt and black pants, repeating a scene that eerily echoed Bruce's fictional death in Game of Death, which was itself released posthumously. And while the industry moved on, as it often does, the public did not, with theories continuing to gain traction from those who believed in a generational curse linked to an ancient Chinese superstition about spirits taking the firstborn son, to others who suspected foul play from secret societies, jealous rivals, or criminal underworld elements tied to martial arts traditions and financial interests threatened by Bruce's insistence on revealing Eastern philosophies to Western audiences. And then there were those who pointed fingers at Hollywood itself, alleging that Brandon's rise was seen as dangerous to the status quo, especially after he'd begun rejecting stereotypical roles and demanding creative control in the mold of his father, who had also battled systemic racism and contractual battles before finally creating Enter the Dragon, a global sensation that changed the face of martial arts cinema, but was followed swiftly by his death, just before he could claim his full power and financial independence, a pattern that mirrored Brandon's final days as well, when he was poised to transition from cult figure to mainstream star, only to be silenced by a freak accident that felt anything but accidental, particularly as rumors persisted that the original footage of the fatal shooting was not destroyed as claimed, but kept hidden perhaps by the studio, perhaps by legal teams, or perhaps as a secret bargaining chip that would never see the light of day. And those who had seen it, allegedly, described a scene far more chaotic and confusing than what the official report suggested, which only fed the belief that there was more to the story, something raw and dangerous, something no one wanted the public to see. And so, the legend grew, fueled by whispers and anniversaries and the eerie calm of those black and white photos of father and son, both resting in the same cemetery in Seattle, graves marked not just by names, but by verses, chosen with care. Bruce's stone, reading your inspiration, continues to guide us toward our personal liberation. And Brandon's inscribed with, because we don't know when we will die. We get to think of life as an inexhaustible well, lines that read more like messages from beyond than words of mourning, and in time. Their story became an archetype, the warrior father and the avenging son, both slain before their time, dressed in white, framed by darkness, and surrounded by a silence too loud to ignore. And while skeptics dismiss the whole saga as coincidence, bad luck, or the tragic risks of physical filmmaking, those who have followed every detail, every contradictory witness statement, every lost report, and every prophetic scene filmed before the real deaths, find themselves unable to fully accept the simplicity of those conclusions. Because how does one explain the timing, the repetition, the wardrobe, the thematic overlaps, the spiritual warnings, the sense that even the films themselves were trying to say something deeper, perhaps about destiny, mortality, or the unseen forces that hover around genius like a shadow that cannot be escaped, no matter how fast or strong you are. And in that silence, the Lee legacy continues, not just in Shannon Lee's careful preservation of her family's memory, and in the continued success of Warrior, the series based on Bruce's original vision, but in the very heart of pop culture, where every young martial artist, every rebellious filmmaker, and every child who watches Enter the Dragon or The Crow feels that chill down their spine is unknowingly tapping into the same current of energy that Bruce and Brandon embodied. A combination of power, passion, and presence that neither death nor time can fully bury. And in this way, they remain eternal, not just as victims of possible conspiracies or cursed bloodlines, but as figures who touched something so deep, so untouchable, that the world didn't know what to do with them and maybe never will.